Welcome back to Simple Dark Stories. I'm your host, Mothie. Tonight's tale follows Malcolm, a man with a hobby. 20 years he spent chasing the oldest question in Scotland, hoarding his vacation days like a man saving matches, waiting for his one shot at the dark water. He found his answer at the bottom of Loch Ness, but he'd wish he'd wanted something else. So lower the lights, night dwellers, and get ready for the depths of time.
Simple dark tales late at night.
The fog sat on the loch like something with weight, low and gray and unwilling to move, and under it the water lay flat and black as a closed eye. Malcolm stood at the end of the dock, with his hands buried in his windbreaker and his backpack pulling at one shoulder. The air was wet in his mouth. It tasted of rotting leaves and lakeweed and the cold iron smell of standing water, and out past the fog a loon called, one long falling note that did not sound like a bird so much as a question no one wanted to answer. He should have felt afraid. Instead, he felt the grin coming, and he let it. He raised his phone and thumbed record. Day 1 of Operation Nessie, reporting live from Loch Ness. Water's cold, fog's thick, and if I'm really lucky, I'm about to make cryptid history. The camera swung to the small, rust-streaked sub tethered off the dock. It looked less like a research vessel than a coffin somebody had welded a window into, the hull patched with mismatched plates, the seams weeping orange down to the waterline. He zoomed on the name flaking off the bow in old red paint. Seeker. Behind him a lighter scrapped and caught. Callum, the man who owned the sub, or at any rate the man who had answered the ad, cupped a cigarette against the damp. He had said maybe 10 words since the train station. 7 of them had been the same 7, delivered twice. Like a warning, he was contractually obliged to repeat, and no longer expected anyone to hear. She'll hold, so long as you don't go deep. Thanks again for renting her out, Malcolm said. Even if the ad was, a bit of a gamble. Callum looked at the water instead of at him. You want to find monsters, don't go trusting every ping the box gives you. The smoke leaked out of him slow. Loch's older than the maps, older than the stories people tell about it. Some of what's down there was down there before there were people to lie about it. Malcolm waited for the rest. There wasn't any. Callum flicked the cigarette into the fog, where it died without a sound, and walked back up the dock, his boots knocking hollow on the boards until the mist folded over him and he was gone. For a moment, there was only Malcolm and his own breathing and the flat black water. He had wanted this since he was 9 years old, since the grainy photographs in the back of a library book, the ones his mother said were fakes, and he had decided, privately and permanently, were not. Since the forums, since the years of gray office carpet and the vacation days he had hoarded like a man saving matches. This was not a tourist cruise with a gift shop at the end of it. This was the thing itself. He stepped down onto the floating platform. The metal gave under him with a groan that traveled up through his boots and into his teeth. His hand was not quite steady on the hatch wheel, and he noticed that and told himself it was the cold. Inside, the cockpit smelled of oil and mildew and something sour underneath, the particular smell of a small space that other men had sweated inside. He folded himself into the seat, opened the laminated manual across his knee, and said the thing out loud because saying it made it real. Just you, the water, and whatever's waiting down there. He brought the systems up. Lights stuttered on, gauges ticked and settled. Outside, the fog pressed its gray face to the glass. Then, with a shudder and a long exhaled hiss, Seeker slid under, and the world above closed over the window like a lid. The last of the surface light was gone inside of 10 seconds. The hum of the sub filled the cabin, a thin mechanical whine with the groan of pressed metal running under it, and the forward lamps bored a narrow cone through water so thick with silt it looked like snow falling in the dark, except the snow fell in every direction at once. 15 meters, Malcolm said, keeping his voice level to prove he could. 20. The manual's line sat printed and patient in his head. Do not exceed recommended depth. He watched the sonar. A flicker crossed the low edge of the scan, long and thin, sliding. His pulse jumped into his throat and stuck there. There you are. He leaned in. Another return. Then more. A loose weave of shapes drifting at the beam's edge, and he brought the nose around toward them with his hands too tight on the yoke. A gauge went amber, then black. He barely saw it. The shapes came together out of the murk, shimmered, resolved, and broke the light all at once. Fish. A school of them, silver and black, turning as one body and gone. Not her. Not a plesiosaur. Not anything. Fish. The camera slid off his knee and hit the deck with a flat little knock. He let his breath out in a long, ragged line and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. Get it together. It was never going to be that easy. He should have gone up then. He knew the number in the manual, and he was already under it. But there is a particular hunger that has been fed on nothing but photographs for 20 years, and it does not know how to be reasonable. He nudged the sub deeper. The sonar pulsed once. One clean return, and it was enough. Long, sinuous, bigger than anything the loch had any business holding. It hung at the far edge of the scan, then peeled away into the black like a thought he couldn't quite finish. That's it, he breathed. That's her. A gauge dimmed to a sick yellow, and he did not look at it. The shape led, and he followed, and some slow part of him understood that this was backwards, that he was the one being drawn, but the understanding never made it up to where his hands were. The sub wove between rocks furred with silt. The water went from dark to darker to something with no bottom to it at all. Then the lamps found the cave, a mouth in the floor of the loch, wide and ragged, framed by spires of stone. His brain insisted on calling teeth. The shape slid between them and was gone. Malcolm hung there in the current with a cold knot pulling tight under his ribs. Turning back felt like one kind of death. Going in felt like another. He knew which one he could live with, and that told him everything about the man he had quietly become. This is what you came for, he said, and pushed the throttle down. The walls rushed in, rough and close. Stone shrieked along the hull, and an alarm woke up orange on the console. Hull integrity warning. Hold together. Come on, hold together. The shape flickered ahead, always just past the reach of the light. Then the water itself began to bend. It shivered, and the beam bent with it into ribbons that had no right to bend, and the sub lurched forward as if the loch had reached down its own throat and grabbed the hull and pulled. His hand scrambled. No, 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 no. The cave folded, light stretched to threads, sound crushed down into one low, unbearable hum. His ears popped hard enough to bring water to his eyes. A flash, white and total. Then nothing. He came back to a hiss of static and a fine, cold mist spitting from somewhere in the hull. The screen was blinking. Surface immediately to assess damage. Surface. Right. Yeah. His voice came out scraped down to the wire. He brought her up, the lamps guttering, the hull creaking around him like a ship inside a much larger ship's story. The water outside the glass was wrong. It was thick and gold and full of slow turning particles, lit from a source that was not his lamps. The sub broke the top. He sat a moment with sweat crawling down his neck. Then he opened the hatch. The air came in, and it was not the air of Scotland. It hit the back of his throat, hot and wet and impossibly rich, and his body took the first breath like it had been drowning its whole life and only now reached the surface. The second breath was better. The third was so good it frightened the small, watching part of him, and then that part went quiet too. He half fell out of the hatch into mud that gave like flesh and stood there swaying, grinning, breathing, feeling against every reasonable expectation, absolutely magnificent. Then he looked up, and the grin froze on his face. Dragonflies. But wrong in scale, each one the length of his forearm, their wings taking the gold light and throwing it back in shards, so that the air above the moss flickered. Like a cathedral window, someone had smashed and hung in midair. Malcolm watched them and felt something in his chest come loose. Some knot he had carried so long he'd stopped feeling it as a knot and started feeling it as himself. Higher up, other shapes crossed the sky, leathery, long, crying out in thin, reedy voices as they wheeled through clouds brighter than any clouds he had ever, and the word went out of his head like a coin dropped down a well. He blinked, started again, brighter than any clouds he had ever. The word, what was the word? Seen. It was seen. Something in him had reached for a fancier one and come back empty, and he almost laughed at that, at himself, at how good he felt while his own vocabulary walked out the door. He turned toward the water, and it took the rest of the breath he had. Long necks rose and fell under a gold surface, sleek bodies sliding just below the shine. One lifted its head and turned a wet, dark eye on the light. A plesiosaur. Not a shadow on a sonar screen, not a smear in a photograph his mother had called a fake. The animal itself, breathing, blinking, real. This isn't, he said, and could not find the end of it, and a laugh came out instead, short and wild. This can't be real. But it was, every square inch of it, a whole world running hot and loud and green, and some cold clerk at the back of his mind, the part that catalogued and doubted and had never once in his life shut up, opened its ledger and wrote a single line. The flyers were pterosaurs. The long necks were plesiosaurs. The dragonflies belonged to an age older than either, and nothing here shared a page. It was as if time itself had been poured out on the ground and stirred, and he was standing in the middle of the mix. The clerk underlined the line once. Malcolm, drunk on the air, read it and felt only wonder and walked on. He walked without deciding to. The moss took his boots with a wet, sucking kindness. The air smelled of crushed fern and turned earth, and under that a sweetness he kept leaning into, one more breath, one deeper pull, just to hold it a second longer on the back of his tongue. I feel incredible, he said, and was embarrassed by the reverence in it, and said it again anyway. He tripped on a root and caught himself against a trunk, and his palm sank into something warm. Amber sap, glossy and slow, welling from a split in the bark. He pulled free with a sound like tape. Small insects hung suspended inside the resin, legs still moving, wings caught mid-beat, dying so slowly they did not appear to be dying at all. He turned his hand in the gold light and watched the sap draw out in long, lazy threads between his fingers, and thought, with the calm of a man admiring a sunset, that it was a beautiful way to be trapped. He wiped his hand on his jacket and went on. He did not hear the first of it. Thud, then thud, thud. too even to be a falling branch, too heavy to be anything he wanted to name. He did not hear it because the light through the canopy came down in bars so solid he half believed he could set a foot on one and climb into the sky. He did not hear it because everything was wonderful, and when everything is wonderful, there's no room left for the sound of something walking toward you. Thud, thud, thud. The ground was keeping time. The moss under his boots trembled a half second before each sound reached him, so that his body knew before his ears did. Malcolm turned, slow, trying to make his eyes hold still. Something moved in the ferns, half seen, half only felt, large and then larger than large as it kept coming and did not finish coming. The foliage shook. Wood cracked somewhere inside it. The warmth went out of him all at once, the way heat leaves a room when a door opens onto winter. "No," he said to no one, and took a step back. It came out of the green slow, the way a thing comes out when it has never in its life had a reason to hurry. A long head first, jaws parted just enough to show the teeth, each one catching a splinter of gold. Then the body hung on legs thick as tree trunks, each footfall driving deep into the soft ground and pulling free with the sound of a boot coming out of a bog. A tail followed, swinging low, laying the ferns flat in a slow arc. Its eyes found him. They were dark and narrow and entirely without hurry, and that was the thing that turned him to water, not the teeth. The patience. An Allosaurus. The clerk in his head noted faintly that Allosaurus was the wrong period too, and then filed the observation somewhere it would do him no good at all. "Oh, God," he whispered. The animal stopped. Its nostrils worked, drawing him in off the air. The head came around, slow, deliberate, and there was something almost like courtesy in how unhurried it was. A predator that had never once had to rush a meal and did not intend to start now. A taste rose at the back of Malcolm's throat, metal and a thin, sick sweetness, like a coin left overnight in syrup. He swallowed it down. Adrenaline, he told himself. It took a step. The ground jumped, and his legs at last remembered what legs were for. Run, he told himself, and ran. The trees smeared past. The gold light came at him in strobing bars. The air was so thick and so rich that every breath felt like a gift he had not earned. His blood loud with it, his legs turning over faster and cleaner than his legs had ever turned. That was why he felt so strong, he thought. That was the air. His chest burned, but a burning chest was just what running was. That was normal. That was fine. His hand shot out and took a branch and swung him round the bend before he had decided to reach for it. The move was quick and clean, and it startled him. The ease of it, the wrongness of a body doing the right thing, a beat ahead of the mind that owned it. He ran harder and tried not to think about what that meant. And under the loudness and the strength, the cold clerk wrote one more line, and this one got through. You are not fast. You are poisoned, and it feels like fast. Those are not the same thing. The sub sat half sunk in the muddy bank ahead, hatch gaping, lamps guttering. There, right there. Come on. A branch broke close behind him, too close, and the roar that followed it went through the ground and up his spine and rattled the teeth in his head. He jumped. It was less a dive than a controlled fall, and he hit the hull hard enough to bruise and clawed his way in, hands slick with dried sap skidding on the metal. The jaws came shut behind him with a wet clap and a gust of hot, rot-smelling air. He hauled the hatch down. It rang like a struck bell. The weight of the thing slammed the hull an instant later and threw him against the far wall, and every light in the cabin flinched. Malcolm folded his arms over his head and made himself small and listened to nothing but his own breath sawing in and out. The outside air hit him like a wall of warm water, and he recognized the feeling now for what it was, a hand slipping into his and lying about being a friend. He knew that. He held the knowing at the very front of his mind as he climbed down into the ferns, which was why it was strange that inside of 30 seconds he had let it slide most of the way out of reach again. The world was just so much. The moss was a green with no bottom to it. The light through the leaves came apart into something so close to music that he caught himself listening for it. He swallowed. Copper. Right, yes, poison. He was being poisoned. Fine. He needed the sap. He fixed his eyes on the wounded tree at the edge of the bank and made himself a single thought and carried it like a full cup. Sap, cloth, tree, back. His hands had the cloth against the bark before he had consciously closed the distance. The resin soaked through, thick, glistening, warm. He pressed harder. Thud. He went still. Thud, thud, slow, deliberate, closer. The sap crawled into the cloth. His hands worked steady, patient, far too calm for a man with that sound coming toward his back. That was the air again. It had taken a file to the edge of everything. The fear, the hurry, the animal part of him that should by rights have been screaming and running. Instead, he felt almost pleasant, and knowing that was the worst thing he had felt yet. A shape came through the ferns, huge, unhurried. Claws sank into the moss. A tail dragged the undergrowth aside. The Allosaurus stepped into the open, with its jaws a little parted and its breath steaming in the wet gold air. And Malcolm did not move, because the cloth was nearly full, and full was the only word left in the cup. 10 more seconds. Then a low growl rolled in from the trees behind it, and a second animal came out of the green at a dead run, smaller, leaner, dark bars down its flanks, and hit the first one broadside with a sound like 2 cars meeting. They went over together in a spray of leaf and black dirt. The first wheeled, snarling. The second found its neck and bit down, and there was a wet, tearing sound that Malcolm felt in his own throat, and the 2 of them rolled off into the ferns in a knot of tails and claws, and did not look back at him at all. He peeled the cloth off the bark. He turned. He walked back to the sub at a pace he was telling himself was measured and rational, and was in truth the fastest a body can move while still pretending it is not running. He sealed the hatch, pressed the loaded cloth into the breech, and held it while the resin set, gluing the lock out. Then he dropped into the pilot's seat, and the false calm drained off him and left the real thing underneath, which was cold. His hands were shaking again. The coin taste sat thick at the back of his tongue. His thoughts kept reaching for words and closing on air. The battery read critical. 1 start left in her. 1. Before he touched the wheel, he stopped. He cracked the hatch, 1 inch, no more. The jungle breathed in through the gap, warm and sweet and loud with life. He took 1 breath of it, just 1. It still tasted like the best thing he had ever put in his lungs, and he understood that it always would, and that this was exactly why he had to close the door. He closed it, set his jaw, and drove Seeker down into the dark. The cave mouth rose up out of the gloom, narrow and jagged, a wound in the floor of the world. He steered into it with his hands steady on the yoke. No alarms this time, no warning lights, only the pressure and the pull, the door recognizing him or not recognizing him. He would never be sure which. The water twisted. A jolt, like being pulled feet first down a drain the size of a cathedral. Metal groaned, light stretched. Then silence. Then a stillness so complete it rang. The sub leveled out. He checked the screens with his heart going. The coordinates read right. And through the viewport, past the shiver of the surface, he could make out a sky that was flat and gray and overcast. An ordinary, miserable highland sky, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Malcolm laughed, and it was a real laugh this time, full and shaking, his whole body in it. I did it. I actually did it. I'm back. He grabbed the camera and hit record and let the grin come all the way up, unhinged and completely earned. Day 1, last entry. I made it. It's real, all of it. And I'm going home, and nobody's ever going to believe a word of it. And I find I could not possibly care less.
He was still laughing when he surfaced, still laughing when he spun the wheel, still laughing when he pushed the hatch up and stood into the open air. The sky was the color of an open wound, deep red along the horizon, gone to black above it, the whole dome of it bruised and boiling. The air came down into the hatch, and it was not Highland air. It smelled of ash and hot iron and the flat electric reek of a storm that had already broken somewhere and left nothing behind it worth saving. Malcolm stood in the open hatch and looked at it and did not move for a long time. Then he climbed back down, dropped into the seat, hit the power. Nothing. The screens flickered, stammered, and went dark. Battery flat, systems gone. No drive, no sonar, no door. The one start had been spent getting here, and here was not home. The door had opened, the way it always opened, and it had let him through, and it had never once promised him the room he had left. Malcolm sat very still. Outside, the sky moved wrong, and then he saw it. Out past the black water, a wall. Water standing on end, gray going to white, reaching from one edge of the world to the other, and climbing, blotting out what was left of the ruined light. The day went dark. The floor of the loch, if it was still a loch, began to shake, a deep grinding tremor that came up through the hull and set his teeth humming in his skull. A sound built at the bottom of hearing and kept building, low, enormous, the sound the planet might make if you held its head under the water, and it screamed. The bolts in the cabin started to rattle. The water outside the glass began impossibly to rise. Malcolm picked up the camera, pressed record. His thumb was steady. He had run out of the things that make a thumb shake. I found her, he said quiet. I really did find her. The tears came without his say-so, and he let them, not lifting a hand to them, watching the wall come on. Nessie's a plesiosaur. They all are. There's a cave in the floor of the loch, and it's a door, and it does not go where you tell it. It goes where it goes. He breathed out slow. I don't know who finds this. I don't know if anyone does, but it was real. It was always real, right up to the end. The far trees, if they were trees, went under the front of the wave and did not come back. The red sky turned to silver. Malcolm set the camera down on the console, screen up, still recording. He leaned back in the seat. He closed his eyes. The roar took everything and then let it all go, folding down into a hush so soft and so complete it was almost kind, like the last of the light going out under deep water and staying out.